Yeah, I think number of participants is still rising, but we can start with introduction. Just want to say welcome everyone to our webinar in this discussion series on tipping elements, the notice of irreversibility and abrupt changes in the Earth system. My name is Victor Brovkin. I lead a group in Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg, Germany. And the goal of this discussion series is to advance knowledge on tipping elements, support efforts to develop a research agenda around tipping points, and design joint experiments. The networks behind this series are the Earth Commission, AIMS, the analysis, integration, modeling of the Earth system. Both AIMS and the Earth Commissions are hosted by Future Earth. There is also Safe Landing Climate Lighthouse activity of a WCRP program. And this event is co-organized by the International Institute for Applied System Analysis, IASA, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and the Global System Institute at the University of Exeter. This event just has some house rule. If you have a question, just drop box, just drop this question in the question and answer box, and please not in the chat. The focus for today is on cascading interactions, and both of our speakers will present before this question and answer session. However, during their talks, feel free to pose questions and indicate to whom your question is directed using these Q&A features at the bottom of a Zoom window, and everyone can upload preferred question. We will then go to the questions in the discussion session after the presentations. Following the event today, we will post recording and the slides on the Tipping Point Series Confetti webpage, so they will be accessible in the future. So I want to start introducing our speakers today. Our first speaker is Nico Wunderling. So he's a postdoc researcher in the Future Lab of Resilience in the Anthropocene at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the Center for Critical Computational Studies at the Goethe Institute, Frankfurt. He is also a guest researcher at the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University. Using methods from nonlinear dynamics, complex system, and Earth system modeling of intermediate complexity, Nico's research focuses on climate tipping elements, their interactions, as well as risk assessment for tipping events and cascading transitions under current global warming trajectories. So thank you, Nico, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Victor, and very happy to share the slides. Can you see everything properly?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, thanks again for having me today. And I'd, in the next 20 minutes, like to talk about concepts and cascading tipping events under global warming, followed by paleoclimate perspectives and future research by Anna von der Heydt. And just to start off, most of you have seen and have engaged in Earth system tipping elements, such as in the biosphere, boreal forests, tropical rainforests, such as the Amazon rainforest and other tropical forests. Then there are tipping elements in the cryosphere, such as parts of the sea ice, if they're considered tipping elements, also permafrost or the large ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica. And lastly, also on the hydrosphere and atmosphere, such as the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, monsoon systems, or atmospheric patterns, atmospheric ocean patterns, such as El Niño. And over the last 20 years, or actually 25 years now, tipping risks and the danger of nonlinear transitions in climate science has decreased global warming thresholds from, I think it was the third assessment report around 2001, from between 4 to 6 degrees, where risk is strongly increasing for nonlinear climate change, down to around today's levels of global warming at around 1 to 1.5 degrees, which is the newest update on science, where some of the tipping elements may actually already become unstable. And last year in the Global Tipping Points report and the year before, David Armstrong McKay and colleagues from the University of Exeter, the Potsdam Institute, and further colleagues have assembled the newest science on climate tipping elements and climate tipping points, as you can see them here. So for instance, these burning embers diagrams, for instance, show for the Greenland ice sheet a tipping point between 1 to 3 degrees above pre-industrial, similar for the Western Arctic ice sheet, as well as for coral reefs, which may actually disappear largely from Earth somewhere between 1 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial. And if we follow current policies and actions, that would actually lead us to temperatures somewhere between 2.5 up to 3 degrees, denoted by the thick black line here, which would endanger a whole range of climate tipping elements, such as the Greenland ice sheet, Western Antarctica, but also tipping elements with higher thresholds, such as the Amazon rainforest or the global ocean currents, and part of which the AMOG is. And today we'd like to talk and discuss about the interactions between climate tipping elements, because these large-scale systems are no entities that are isolated on Earth, but they can actually interact. And these interactions between tipping elements can become quite important, dependent on the level of global warming. And just to give you a brief example, we can have a look at this little video here, where there is a cascading transition from the Greenland ice sheet over to equatorial regions, over the AMOG, down to the Southern Hemisphere, Western Arctic ice sheet, and the Amazon rainforest. And as we'll hear in a minute, typical interactions or typical cascading transitions are started by the large ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica, traveling down southward or traveling towards equatorial regions via global ocean currents, possibly even finishing up in and around the Amazon rainforest. So for the last Global Tipping Points report at the end of last year, I and Anna von der Heydt and many other colleagues, some of them I've seen here in the audience, have assembled the newest update on science on climate tipping point interactions and risk of cascading transitions in the Earth climate system, assembling the knowledge on the interactions between a whole set of different tipping elements, such as the Greenland ice sheet, the AMOG, Amazon rainforest, but also taken into account nonlinear Earth system components that are possibly or even likely no tipping elements, such as the Arctic sea ice or the El Niño Southern Oscillation, but they are important as global mediators and interactors for the global system, linking different climate tipping elements, and as such, they are important enough to take them into account. And if we add the newest knowledge on interactions between tipping elements, you can already from a visual appearance see that most of these links are red, denoting destabilizing effects, meaning that, for instance, if one of these tipping elements starts to tip, that has destabilizing effect on subsequent tipping elements. So, for instance, Greenland starts to melt, puts fresh water into the ocean, and by that weakens the AMOG. But there are actually different types of cascade and different conceptualizations of what cascading transitions actually are. And there are three important groups that we can distinguish and differentiate. And the first one of this is a so-called two-phase cascade, where we have two tipping elements, two subsystems, two dominoes that are relatively far away from each other, where the tipping of subsystem one actually is not sufficient to tip over subsystem two, but subsystem one, domino one, has to be driven further towards subsystem two so that this tips as well. So basically, tipping of subsystem one destabilizes system two, but it's not sufficient to also tip that over, but some additional forcing is required. Then type number two, that's the domino cascade, which is what I would say the classic notion of a cascading transition of a tipping cascade, where subsystem 1 causes or triggers the tipping of subsystem 2. So subsystem 1 touches 2, and both of them tip over. And lastly, a joint cascade where two subsystems, X1 and X2, are essentially one system or very close to each other, so that if subsystem 1 starts to tip over, that would immediately tip over also subsystem number 2. So there are these three situations that we can distinguish. And similar, actually, to individual tipping elements, there are two very similar types of cascades in terms of how they function. So here is a conceptualized model of the Greenland ice sheet and an AMOC box model. And their researchers around Ann-Christine Klose found that not only bifurcation-induced cascading transitions are possible, where the Greenland ice sheet is melting slowly and the AMOC is put slowly across its tipping threshold, but also if forcing and Greenland melt is quick enough, that might lead to rate-induced tipping cascades. Quite similar to what we can have with individual tipping elements, the bifurcation-induced tipping or rate-induced tipping, dependent on the speed of the forcing. So not only taking into account individual tipping elements, but also interactions between tipping elements, we can develop very simplified models of tipping elements and their interactions dependent on important uncertainties from the current state of science, but also dependent on global warming trajectories, here shown as an overshoot trajectory. And then there are, so X is the state of the tipping elements here, dependent on individual terms, this nonlinear term here, plus the critical parameter here, and the interactions between the tipping elements. So the important uncertainties, of course, lie within the critical temperatures, the interactions between the tipping elements, as well as the timescales of tipping. So for instance, the Greenland ice sheet has a critical temperature somewhere between 1 to 3 degrees as an interaction to the AMOC that is constrained, that has uncertainties on the order of a magnitude. And lastly, timescales of the Greenland ice sheets, timescales of tipping are somewhere on the order of centuries to millennia. So quite a high range of uncertainties. And to deal with them, we can actually use Monte Carlo simulations on the order of several hundreds of thousands up to millions of ensemble members in order to come up with tipping risks dependent on the level of global warming and dependent on the exact overshoot trajectory that global society is following. So what we denote as tipping risk here is actually the probability or the likelihood that a tipping element, that any of the here observed tipping elements, Greenland, AMOC, Amazon rainforest, West Antarctica, is residing in the tip regime at the end or at a certain point in time of our simulation. So tipping risk is the number in this Monte Carlo ensemble, is the number of simulations that end up in a tip regime over the number of the entire ensemble. And by doing so and running overshoot trajectories for several thousands, tens of thousands, and even millions of times, we can come up with risk maps. And a particular example is shown here, where the x-axis denotes the peak temperature. So how high does an overshoot trajectory go? Then the convergence time denotes how long after the peak temperature do we need in order to get back to a certain level of landing temperature or convergence temperature, in this case, 1 degree. And then the color denotes the associated tipping risk with this particular overshoot trajectory. And just to draw out one particular example, here in the bottom left, where the peak temperature just touches 2 degrees, and after 100 years, we're back at the convergence temperature of 1 degree above pre-industrial, that leads to tipping risks on the order of 15%. So here the red curve comes from 0 degrees, crosses 1 and 1.5 degrees, just touches 2 degrees, and then after 100 years settles down on 1 degree above pre-industrial. And following our Monte Carlo approach here, that would lead to tipping risks beyond 10%. That one of the four, or at least one of the four tipping elements resides in the tip regime at the end of the simulation. And we're particularly looking into these four tipping elements because the interactions between them are most acceptably well understood, so that we can run a Monte Carlo ensemble across the uncertainties of these tipping elements. So summary, if 2 degrees are overshot, a tipping risk quickly reach values beyond 10 or even 50%, and safe overshoots require a convergence temperature of around today's levels of global warming, better even 1 degree of global warming. So looking into overshoot trajectories on this more general level, we can also look into overshoot trajectories in a more particular level based on policy relevant overshoot trajectories, where some of these overshoot trajectories here shown in emission space are more optimistic following Paris Climate Agreement targets, while other ones such as moderate actions or current policy overshoots do not and still delay sustainability transitions on a global level until mid or even end of this century. And then using the FAIR emulator and taking into account climate sensitivity and carbon feedbacks, these emission space trajectories can be translated into temperature space, and regarding to that, into overshoot trajectories, overshooting 1.5 degrees in the most optimistic cases, or even overshooting 2 degrees above pre-industrial. And there's quite a remarkable result in my view when we observe and do an uncertainty analysis around these overshoots. We observe that if the peak temperature of these policy relevant overshoots transgresses 2 degrees above pre-industrial, then there's a nonlinear increase in tipping risk, meaning that for every 1/10 of a degree below approximately 2 degrees above pre-industrial, there is 1.5% of additional tipping risk. But if 2 degrees on peak temperature crossed, then this increase in tipping risk per every centigrade is doubled or even tripled. And this is a study that is now accepted in Nature Communications and will come out soon. And there's a collaboration between the JASA Institute actually and the Potsdam Institute. So what has all that to do with interactions and potentially cascading transitions? So imagine a scenario where we would follow a trajectory that would land at 2 degrees above pre-industrial and be held constant at this level. And what we find then is that the tipping risk, or respectively the number of tipped elements, remember we're still talking about the 4 tipping elements, AMOC, Greenland, West Antarctica, and the Amazon rainforest, in different interaction scenarios, where this 0.0 here means that there is no interaction between a hypothesized scenario where there's no interactions between the tipping elements at 0.0, and 1 means that interactions are as important as the individual dynamics. And if we look at that, we find that even intermediate interactions somewhere between 0.1, 0.3, maybe 0.4 are sufficient for triggering cascading transitions at its majority. And additional hypothesized stronger interactions only lead to a marginal further increase of tipping risks or a number of cascading transitions. So that means that cascading transitions are already relevant for intermediate interaction strength. And even further, just very briefly, interactions and cascading transitions are relevant for temperatures as low as 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. So that means tipping events relevant from around 1 degree above pre-industrial, tipping cascades really become relevant for temperatures on the order of 1.5 degrees and certainly beyond that. So interactions between tipping elements, going back to the global tipping elements, interact across scales in space, from subcontinental up to continental onto global levels, but also across scales in time, from tipping times within months up to years, up to centuries to millennia, for the large ice sheets on Antarctica and Greenland. So tipping elements and their interactions both span this entire regime from small scale or subcontinental scales up to global, from months to years up to millennia. And lastly, there are not only interactions between the large-scale tipping elements, such as between AMOC and Greenland, but also what one could call intra-actions, so cascading transitions and tipping point interactions within tipping elements. And a particular example here is the Amazon rainforest, where moisture recycling, so rain that falls down over some part of the rainforest, is evaporated again and transported further, may lead to cascading transitions. For instance, if deforestation is taking place, that might have long-ranging intra-acting effects. And here's a little video of how clouds can evolve over South America. And a recent study by Niels Bocho and Niklas Börs has shown that, and again, these arrows denote the main wind and main atmospheric water direction, that deforestation beyond a certain level can actually lead to a cascading transition, so that regions, forested regions in direction of the wind, if too much is deforested, are not stable anymore and could transition away from a forested state. And this is something that Niels Bocho and Niklas Börs have found, but also within our group, we found that network effects or cascading transitions actually can play quite an important role, up to 1/3 of all the tipping events that we would observe under certain scenarios of climate change. And just to close off, climate change and tipping element interactions usually play in the same direction, so are destabilizing, meaning that global warming is putting pressure on the Greenland ice sheet, which may then eventually tip over, which then would have destabilizing effects on Atlantic Ocean currents. But that doesn't need to be the case for all the interactions. And one particular interaction where I feel more and more evidence is starting to emerge is from the AMOC onto the Amazon rainforest, where there are, in this case here, a study by Danian and colleagues showing that a pure climate change scenario, a SSP 585 scenario, makes the eastern part of the Amazon rainforest very dry, while if there's an additional AMOC collapse, this dryness signal is mediated by the AMOC collapse, actually increasing rainfall over the eastern Amazon rainforest. Summarized, climate change and tipping element actions not necessarily need to play in the same destabilizing directions, but there are some examples where they actually have counteracting effects. So concluding, most of the interactions that we found in our large-scale review for the Global Tipping Point report are actually destabilizing. Second, interactions are also important, and not only interactions between tipping elements. And lastly, tipping element interactions contribute to tipping risks at global warming levels starting from around 1.5 degrees and beyond. And with that, thank you very much. I'm very happy to hand over back to you, Victor.
Thank you very much, Nico, for your inspiring presentation. And yeah, since we are close to 1.5 degrees, it already looks very scary. So just I want to remind everyone, so if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box, and we will address them after the next presentation, so that we just collect the questions at the end. So and now let me just have a pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Anna von der Heydt is Associate Professor at the Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Research at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Her work focused on paleoclimate phenomena and transition behavior in climate using hierarchy of climate models and stochastic dynamical system approaches. Anna uses state-of-the-art or high-resolution climate models to quantify the state-dependent climate response to forcing. Among other tasks, Anna currently works on a Dutch Science Foundation-funded project, interacting climate tipping elements, when does tipping cause tipping, and on the European Union-funded project on quantifying climate tipping points and their impacts, or ClimTip. So that's really very interesting work. Going from the perspective on the future, now we go a bit to the paleo. And Anna, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Victor, for the introduction and having me here. And also thanks to Nico, who has already introduced a lot of these interactions between tipping elements and tipping elements themselves. So I can focus here now a bit on, so we know these interactions are there, and we can sort of quantify them, but there is still a lot of work to do. So what I will do now is to focus a bit on what kind of examples do we have from paleoclimate, what we can learn about connections between tipping elements, and also see what we can do to further quantify these links and the tipping potential itself. Okay, yes. So one thing I would like to show first is, one thing to realize is that we really have to do in the climate system with a lot of different timescales, also spatial scales, but in particular timescales. And that is what Nico mentioned in one of his last slides, that even the individual tipping elements, they act on very different temporal scales. Their interactions also act on very different timescales. So it is very difficult to say what causes what in this context, and we need different types of simulations and different types of records and lengths of time series to actually quantify individual processes here. So what I show here is sort of a hypothetical spectrum of climate variability, if we could ever measure that, but we will not be able to measure it in such in detail. So it is a drawing, in fact, but it illustrates that there is a lot of variations on shorter and longer timescales that are partly caused by external forcings, but much more is actually caused by internal variations. And then there is, of course, interaction between these two things. So you will have a mix of internally, externally forced variability in there. There will be synchronization effects and all these kind of things. Now, one thing that we even don't see in such a spectrum is if there is a single or a few very abrupt transitions that we would attribute to a tipping event or a tipping cascade. So if we look into the paleoclimate record, and what you see here is the sort of global deep sea oxygen isotope record over the last 65 million years. I mean, note that the timescale here is a bit different in scale. It is smaller on the or more fine on the right-hand side. So we start on the left in this very warm climate of the early Cenozoic, and then there is a transition towards a colder one, but there is a lot of variability in there. Now this oxygen isotope record reflects both the average temperature, but it also reflects ice volume, how much ice there is on Earth in a way. And now what I will do in this talk now is I will highlight two sort of periods, events. One is here, this big jump in the oxygen isotope record that we observed around 35 million years ago, which has to do with the glaciation of the Antarctic continent. We call the Eocene-Oligocene transition, and which is very likely that more than one process is involved. So we could likely call that a tipping cascade, potentially. And the other thing I will focus on is these abrupt warming events that we observed during the last glacial period, so-called Dansgaard-Oeschger events, and also into the more recent warm period. So just to remind you, you've seen this this plot before on the interactions that we know between tipping elements. It looks, I mean, most of them are destabilizing, as we call them. They can be, but well, that doesn't mean that everything tips directly, as Nico has also illustrated, but at least they seem to be destabilizing. But we want to say, give this a number also. So there is clearly links between, for example, the Greenland ice sheet, the AMOC, and the West Antarctic ice sheet. So if we talk about the Antarctic ice sheet, we need to take into account the other parts of the climate system as well. However, tipping cascades can be very complicated. There are different types, and there are stabilizing and destabilizing effects. So just as an example here, if we look at these AMOC ice cascades in the northern and the southern hemisphere, the Greenland ice sheet AMOC link seems to be really strongly destabilizing. That's very clear, as long as it's fast enough melting. Now the AMOC onto the West Antarctic ice sheet, we believe it should also be destabilizing, because when the AMOC collapses, it will warm the southern hemisphere. But there could be a stabilizing effect back from the West Antarctic ice sheet on the AMOC. And that has been illustrated in a very simple box model, simple ice sheet model thing, that there is actually, depending on when the West Antarctic ice sheet melts relatively to the Greenland ice sheet, so this is the delay in this yellow-blue plot on the x-axis, and depending on how strongly the AMOC and the West Antarctic ice sheet are coupled, you can either have an AMOC collapse or not. So you can prevent the AMOC collapse basically by melting the West Antarctic ice sheet fast enough. So that's a suggestion. And this becomes even more complicated when you go into different timescales. If there is rate-dependent tipping, if there is noise in the system, then you can modify this kind of behavior as well. So it is very difficult to say what kind of cascades we actually observe if we have these very different links in here. Now let's go to this Eocene-Oligocene transition, where we observe a big glaciation event of Antarctica. And just to give you an insight in what is it, the Eocene-Oligocene transition, what we observe in the paleo record, and here in blue you see the oxygen isotope record again, from 35 to 31 million years ago, from bottom to top. What you observe there is that there are actually two steps, a bit interrupted by a gray hiatus, but you have two steps, each of them about 40,000 year long, with a plateau in between that's about 200,000 years long. And both of these steps reflect cooling and potentially ice growth. It's not so clear which is how much is what, but in at least it's both will be happening. In addition, in the purple line, this is the carbon isotope record. There also are lots of things happening, and sort of you can see these steps back as well. So it's clear that there will be some changes in carbon cycling as well. Now there is a classical view why this has happened at the end of the Eocene, that has to do with the fact that CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere were declining. And with ice sheet models, it has been shown very long time ago on the right-hand side, the plots, that when you have, say, a small ice sheet on the Antarctic continent, and you apply orbital forcing, and you apply a slowly decreasing CO2 concentration, at some points, these small ice caps will sort of merge together, and then they can very quickly form a big ice sheet. And that is sort of the transition. So this is the idea that has been around for a long time, that actually when the CO2 concentration declines, at some point a threshold is reached that allows a big ice sheet to be built on the Antarctic continent, and that would be reflected in this oxygen isotope record. However, more recently, there is more to just the ice sheet, of course, in the climate system. And more recently, there have been more detailed climate model simulations of this Eocene warm climate, which show that it is not so easy to actually glaciate the Antarctic continent when we are in a very warm climate. What you see in this graph here is the result of a long equilibrium simulation with a CMIP type model, the CESM, for the Eocene climate, so geography and no ice on Antarctica, and at 2 times pre-industrial CO2 concentration, which is relatively low for the late Eocene. And what you see in colors here is sort of a climate classification index, the most probable one in that region above the Antarctic continent. So everything that is red in this graph suggests that there is really a monsoon, subtropical monsoon-like climate, at least in summer. I mean, it's above the South Pole, so there will still be cold winters, but in summer, at least, it will be really very, very monsoon-like. The green areas are sort of, well, evergreen, so you will find a lot of vegetation in that region. And only the light blue parts, these are sort of climates that would potentially allow for mountain glaciers to survive the next summer. So that indicates that it's not so easy to grow an ice sheet out of nothing on the Antarctic continent. So something needs to break this monsoon-like climate before actually it is possible to grow an ice sheet on there. And there comes in, of course, tectonic changes, changes in the ocean circulation, potentially associated with changes in the atmospheric regime that is in there. So when you put all this together, you can come up with a quite complicated view of a cascading events in Eocene-Oligocene transition. Potentially, you have tectonic changes, gateways. You will affect the ocean circulation. And on top of that, there are variations in orbital forcing, of course, that some of them are favorable for ice sheet growth. And then you set into motion all kinds of temperature and hydrology effects, carbon cycle, and eventually, of course, also on ecosystems. Now, all of these arrows we have drawn here are stippled, which means that they're really very uncertain. And I'll go to the second part here. The Dansgaard-Oeschger events, which are actually much more recent, and what idea we have here on the on a tipping cascade. So what is this? During the last glacial period, about 20 very abrupt Greenland warming events have been observed since a long time. That's what you see in the blue line, more or less, so the Greenland ice core record. They have also been observed in the West Antarctic ice core record, actually. And when you zoom in on, say, the last 30,000 years, you really see some of these very peaky events that we call the Dansgaard-Oeschger events. So it starts with an extremely abrupt warming and then sort of a slightly slower decline again, but there it ends again with a relatively abrupt warming. What we think, what happens there is that during the warming and a recovery of the AMOG actually happens from the glacial period. It has to do with sea ice retreat as well. Greenland is warming quite a bit, and it sets into motion all kinds of other processes. What is obvious here, or what is interesting here also, that there are also Heinrich events, which is a different thing, but it gives quite some icebergs into the North Atlantic region. But you observe very often that there is a Heinrich event and then a series of Dansgaard-Oeschger events happening in a way before the next Heinrich event also happens. So in the next slide, I will show a number of records that have been collected around at the end of the Heinrich event 4 in this green region marked there, which was followed by a few relatively strong Dansgaard-Oeschger events to see what happens there. So what you see here on the right is indeed a series of different records for the AMOG strength, the sea ice extent, the Greenland temperature, and the North Atlantic sea surface temperature, also dust on Greenland, for example, monsoon strength of the Southeast Asian monsoon. We believe also a record for this shift of the ITZZ and the South American monsoon in the end. And this sort of hatched region, that's the end, the transition from the Heinrich event to the next Dansgaard-Oeschger event. It also actually reflects quite some uncertainty in timing. So just by looking at these time series, it is not possible to say what causes what, because we cannot really trust all these beliefs, these time series. But of course, you can think of what would cause what. If you have AMOC recovery, you will have sea surface temperature warming. That will affect the moisture balance in that region. The northern sea ice will also be affected, and that goes on until the atmosphere and land processes as well. Now, one thing that we want to put numbers on these arrows we have drawn here for the interactions that we know, and that is not so easy to actually quantify. Correlations would be very nice, but they can be very biased. So there are some promising methods that use what we call partial correlations. And I will illustrate very briefly how these methods can be used, actually not for tipping interactions, but within one subsystem for interactions between there. Because one thing that you need for this method to apply or to be useful is you need a very clear hypothesis about a physical mechanism. What I show you here is the subpolar gyre region in the North Atlantic that has been hypothesized to be a tipping element in itself. And there is a theoretical idea of what happens there. So when the strength of the subpolar gyre changes, you get affected the sea surface salinity in the center of the gyre. That can affect the convection that happens there. So you would see that back in mixed layer depth in terms of a model. And that then affects the temperature of the intermediate water column. You get density changes in the center, and eventually you get back into the strength of the subpolar gyre. Now, what we can do with these methods of partial correlations is we put these hypotheses in, and then we test whether, for example, the CMAP models can follow this mechanism or not. That is currently work in progress, but we would like to use this kind of method also for, say, causality inference for these interactions between tipping elements. Now, one thing is that we have to realize is that here we talk about CMAP models. Most of these processes between the different tipping elements, like the Greenland ice sheet and the interaction with the AMOC, they are not really represented in these models. It is very difficult. I mean, some, of course, have a dynamic vegetation, so you could say something about the Amazon rainforest, but clearly the longer timescale processes are not dynamically included in these kind of simulations. So in order to apply these causality measures, we actually need different types of simulations. And that's why I would like to end with sort of a need for new Earth system model experiments that are currently also being set up already, particularly for the slower components of the climate system, like the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. It is also very instructive to have simulations where these are simply tipped. So that's what we call the make it happen simulations. So you could remove the Greenland ice sheet and then see what happens in the rest of the world. That would be very helpful for quantifying links to other regions in the world. And it also links back to paleoclimate simulations. Actually, there are a number of model intercomparison projects already ongoing for many years for the Pliocene, for the Miocene, and the Eocene, and other time periods. These actually are also very useful for quantifying links between different regions in the world, different tipping elements in there. And I just would like to close with an initiative that is already starting up, this What If model intercomparison project to provide these kind of simulations here. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your excellent and also inspiring talk. And it's also very nice complemented Nico's presentation. And now we are taking questions for both speakers. And just to start discussion, I would like to just take a first question, which is to Nico. And that is about climate model and experiments, which you are using for the tipping point analysis. If you use model ensemble, can you explain your motivation in selecting them? And yeah.
Yeah, sure. So the model ensemble that we're using, what we use for that is the newest update on tipping, on individual tipping elements first. So on all the individual components, this is timescales of tipping, but also critical thresholds that we know from literature, paleo evidence, but also Earth system model evidence. Then second, we use knowledge from the interactions from Earth system science, but also from a relatively old survey. And with these uncertainties, we then use a very or extremely simplified model for dynamical systems in order to be able to run thousands or even millions of ensemble members to come up with what we call tipping risk. So basically a likelihood of losing one or several tipping elements.
Yeah, thank you. Nico, I have question myself to Anna actually, because in the paleo we always have evidence that some abrupt changes were happening in the past, and these interactions or cascades were happened as you nicely presented during abrupt events. My question is, when we go far back in the past, in the deep past, what is the quality of the data? Could we just get more out of them than we can get out of a more recent past over, let's say, last several thousand years?
Yes, thank you, Victor. This is a very good question. I mean, the quality of the data when you go back to, for example, the Eocene-Oligocene transition is, of course, very, very different than the more recent one in terms of temporal resolution, but also in terms of what kind of proxies you have. I mean, most of these data come from ocean sediments, so not from ice cores anymore. So that makes the quality much less. Nevertheless, I think we still can learn quite a bit because these were much warmer climates. And it is very useful to complement these measurements with Earth system modeled simulations, which cannot simulate, say, the whole Eocene-Oligocene transition, because that takes way too long time, but you can have these snapshots before and after, maybe intermediate ones as well. As I've shown, that shows that on the Antarctic continent, you get a very strange monsoon-like climate when you have no ice there, right? So these kind of dynamics are very interesting. And but it's not always easy to verify that with actual proxies from the Antarctic continent, for example, because there is no very limited records on there.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. There is also a question from Gabriele Dreyfus, and that's more policy relevant. What are the scientific questions that a potential IPCC tipping point special report could explore? I know that likely it will be no IPCC special report on climate tipping points during the AR7, but of course it's a good question. So what aspects are really characterized by deep uncertainty? What do we know better, and what could be used for informing policymakers, and what is less known? I think, Nico, perhaps you can start.
Yeah, I can start off and you can add up on that, Anna. So if there would be an IPCC report on tipping elements, or actually something similar, we will have a second version of the Global Tipping Points report issued for COP30 in around 1.5 years. And what I would think is really helpful are actually 3 things there. And one is impact assessments, actually. So what are the impacts from losing Greenland, losing the Amazon rainforest, losing Atlantic Ocean currents? And that is something that is started to be discovered now, for instance, in What If MIP, but also in TIP-MIP endeavors in these what if or make it happen scenario. So that's one, impact assessments from land use up to even financial assessments if possible. Second is actually overshoot assessment, as Oliver Geden, and I've seen that in the chat or in the Q&A. He's very much involved into global and German climate policy. So overshoots is second. That's also very important to assess. And third would be, in my view, taking into account complex Earth system models, but also take their knowledge into simpler models and come up with risk assessment. So actually, I think we need the whole range of different Earth system modeling approaches, from the simple ones to the fully complex ones, or rather the other way around, from the complex ones to the simple ones. On to you, Anna.
Yes, I think this is, I fully support what you already said. I think in addition, we should be, we should even more be including the paleoclimate record. And I know that we most of us have been saying this since a long time. And it is not so direct. I mean, we will never be able to say, well, what happened in the past will exactly repeat in the future. That's not going to happen. But it really provides us an enormous amount of insight when it comes to what kind of processes cause what, also what kind of timescales are at work there. But all these proxy records, we always have to complement with the whole series of conceptual up to more complex and Earth system models, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. There is a specification of a question actually to you, Nico. And that's the question was mostly about what are the data required from the model for tipping point analysis. So if there are other models which can be used for it, for example.
Yeah, so the data for that we would actually need for risk assessments is on the interactions, is on the time scales, and is on the tipping points, and also on the spatial scales. And that can be informed by either going up the level of complexity in models, so by complex Earth system models, one. It can also be supported by paleoclimate evidence, as Anna just pointed out. And also more recently, I've heard and there are some endeavors that go more and more into the Earth observation direction, using satellites, monitoring the Earth, monitoring tipping elements in particular. And one of the outcomes that is already there are early warning signals, for instance, on particular tipping elements, such as the Amazon rainforest or parts of the Greenland ice sheet. And some groups are starting or have already done that at TU Munich or at the University of Exeter.
Yeah, and Anna, there is also a question relevant to the paleo, and from Parvati. So what are chances for tipping elements for total collapse, and can we get any insight on them from paleo data? Just to foresee a question. The future, it's of course very difficult question. You already partly answered it, but what more can we do with the paleo data?
Well, what the question is a bit, what would we call a total collapse, right? I mean, there have been ideas around for that have been called also hothouse world, and which you would maybe call a total collapse. But I think what comes from paleoclimate evidence is that it is not so likely that a total collapse will happen. And you can anticipate, you can understand that also from, say, all these interactions that we have outlined. I mean, that many of them seem to be destabilizing, but there are also stabilizing ones. So, and it is very, very difficult to say that you will always have one thing tipping and then the whole cascade, everything is also tipping. That's not the case, but there are different timescales involved, and there are different dynamics involved. That doesn't mean that this is not dangerous, right? I mean, we might not go to a runaway hothouse climate, but still the changes that can be expected from some tipping elements, even if they are regional, for particularly for human societies, they can be devastating still, right? But it's not a total collapse. So I think we need to focus much more on say the regional and the individual tipping elements, because they are really important for us, right? I mean, the Earth will still be there, I guess, and so in this sense, I mean, I think that the total collapse is not very likely, but there is much more to learn on the more detailed view.
Yeah, if I may follow with this question to Nico. So you said a few words about remote sensing and early warnings signal coming from obviously time series, because we need a bit longer observations but do you, for tipping interactions, do you see a perspective so that we can learn from remote sensing observations how this interaction is going?
Yeah, maybe two things there. So for interactions, certainly yes. For cascading transitions, there are actually some theoretical limitations. And let me start with tipping cascades and then go to interactions. For cascading transitions, it actually depends on whether we are able to even theoretically observe early warning signals, dependent on how close tipping elements are together or how strong these interactions are. So for instance, in this what has been called a joint cascade, where tipping elements are very close to each other, it is not possible to find early warning signals for the cascade, but only for the individual tipping elements. And it becomes easier the weaker the interactions are, well, with some limitations, of course, but the weaker the interactions are and the more important the individual forcing is, the easier or the simpler the traditional methods such as variance increase or autocorrelation increase can be used. And yeah, if people are interested, I can just send a link in the chat to the paper where we elaborate a bit on that. And on the interactions, I'd like to come back to a point that Anna made in her presentation on looking into time series, not only into one time series, but also substituting space for time. And by that, also looking into not only correlations between tipping elements, as has been done before, but also into more like causal effect measures. And this is something that Anna is looking into, and also a couple of other groups and related to the Potsdam Institute. And we're also now starting to look into basically into more than just correlations between different subsystems, but into causal pathways from, say, the subpolar gyre within itself, or subpolar gyre with the AMOC, or the AMOC with atmospheric patterns. And the limit clearly is the availability of the data and the right data. And maybe Anna can add a bit more on that, as I know that one of your postdocs is working on causal detection between and within tipping elements.
Well, yes, I mean, this is what I briefly showed in the presentation. I mean, this is still work in progress. I mean, and I think these causal inference methods are very, very promising, but you need the right data for that. So that is one thing that we discovered there, is that you really need a very clear idea of what the mechanism is you want to test. And then you can say, well, so many models do have this and so many models don't have it. And then you can have a look what is there. But if you have a bit vague idea of what causes what, then it is extremely difficult to interpret these kind of things. And well, and in addition, you need the right simulations for that, right? I mean, you can look into the CMAP models, but you have to rely on only those processes on those timescales of the simulations that actually are dynamically represented there. So you exclude quite a number of interactions already.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. There was a question from Tom Carroll and about loss of early spring snow cover in the northern hemisphere, and this can be used to tell us about tipping elements, or because there is interaction, there is impact of Arctic warming and on sea ice, on AMOC and all the cryosphere. So of course, Nico, you know about discussion of sea ice and cryosphere, why some of tipping elements are there and why some are not. Could you just elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, right. So of course it depends on whether sea ice or snow extent is considered a tipping element, and that might also already be a reason why this hasn't been part of the map that Anna and me have shown. But having said that, it also means that, for instance, snow cover could actually be used as an early warning signal for subsequent tipping elements. So basically, if there is if snow cover extend in spring is melting quicker, that can be seen as an early warning signal also subsequently for the sea ice, or even for larger ice sheets, dependent on the data that is there.
Yeah, Anna, there was a question from Paul Kushner, and that's on intercomparison projects like What If MIP. And the question is, what are prospects for using emulators of comprehensive of-system models to assess cascading tipping point risk? So, of course, you use comprehensive model, but could we learn also from emulators, from much more simplified models?
Yes, this is certainly a way to go, but you still need the Earth system models to build these emulators, and I think so. In that sense, I mean, I still think we need an intercomparison project like the What If MIP, but we have to make use of these data and of the other model intercomparison projects that are already there. To build sufficient and good emulators of these. Many of them need to be very dedicated for a specific problem. There is also quite some work invested and will be invested in more in making sort of, it's a bit more than an emulator. It's say fast Earth system models. So that makes use of partly machine learning techniques, partly emulator-like ideas that sort of, but still this also needs calibrating points from real Earth system models. And currently there will be quite some work spent on creating emulators or these kinds of fast Earth system models for paleoclimate. So to be able to run for 1 million years and have an evolving climate over these timescales.
Yeah,
that is certainly a promising way to go, but it still has to be done.
And maybe just adding up on that, it actually gives you a separation of, for the future, which emission trajectories and which nationally determined contributions lead to safe overshoots and which ones do not. So there is an inherent need for using the complex Earth system models to inform climate emulators and then be a bit more agile in evaluating potential emission scenarios. So I do think that in this case, this is a really good example of why we actually need models across different scales, also informed by newest machine learning techniques, as well as Earth observation missions.
Yeah, there is also a question in the webinar chat, and that's about relying on greenhouse gases emission scenarios. So, as we know, for in CMIP6, we run a comprehensive model mostly with prescribed CO2 concentrations and other greenhouse gases. So the question is, if they interact if we have tipping and there is interaction with atmospheric greenhouse gases concentration, I guess, Nico, you might have already used that in a kind of simplified models. But Anna, I guess you also, your group also have looked what could happen if AMOC collapses, for example.
Yeah. Would you like to start, Anna?
Yeah, that's fine. Well, indeed, I mean, there have been some studies in looking on the effect of, say, an AMOC collapse on the carbon cycle. So that requires, say, Earth system model simulations with a dynamic carbon cycle, so not just, and these are then, say, emission driven. And there seems to be indeed a feedback that could increase the CO2 concentration even more when such a tipping effect. It seems to be relatively weak, but that's sort of the first indication what can happen as a cascading impact of one tipping. Whether you would call that tipping or not, the following one, it doesn't need to be tipping, but it is a feedback on the CO2 concentration. Yeah, these are things that are just about to be explored, I think, and need to be studied much more.
Exactly. I mean, additional feedback such as from permafrost, Victor, and you are probably the expert on that.
Exactly.
Is to be taken into account. And I mean, Anna, we have done that or at least for me, in very simplified models to map out the potential effect of these feedbacks. And they do have, as Anna pointed out, an important role within the stability of the Earth climate, but very likely not to an extent so that we have a hothouse Earth state or some kind of runaway effect. So just to make clear that these feedbacks are important, but do not lead to something like a hothouse state. At least that's not shown by our Earth system models.
Yeah, just a couple of questions on economic or social effects coming out of this tipping interaction so Kate Lamb asked about impacts of tipping on social, so financial stability. And Terry Thompson asked about also impact on macroeconomic indicators like GDP growth, for example. So the question is to you both.
I can take a first go if you want. So what I think is that impact assessments, such as with what if MIP, tip MIP, and also many other endeavors have to take into account financial stability. And this is, I mean, it has been researched a bit. I know some studies from the London School of Economics around the social cost of carbon. Simon Dietz and James Rising are two names that come to my mind. But certainly this is a huge gap that needs to be addressed. And is one of the next steps, in my view, on climate tipping point science reaching up into society. And I'm sure there are many plans ahead. I know that there is a broad interest, and maybe you know a bit more about that, Anna. But I also know that this is not entirely our community as of yet.
No, that's true. I mean, I know there are some studies going in the direction of integrated assessment models and these kind of things. And one of the problems that you come across there, I know, is that many of these models, these economic models, are a bit too linear in a way. And we are not sure whether this is the correct way of representing economics. Let's put it in that way. I mean, in a sense, in the physical climate system, we are in a very privileged position that we actually know our equations to solve, which is not necessarily the case in economics. And of course, there are equations and there are laws, but it is much more difficult to say this model is better than the other one for a number of different things. Right, so that what makes it very difficult. But I think there are some initiatives in making these economic models and particularly the integrated assessments models a bit more sophisticated to include these kind of effects.
And indeed needs to be taken into account. And
definitely,
there are some research endeavors, and hopefully we'll be involved in that from the Earth system science community in order to make the link back to economics. That's just a couple of days ago, we had a little workshop, and there people said that this is, and you're probably right, Kate and Gabriele, that this is one of the major levers for social change if economic damages and if economic benefit can be quantified in a proper way. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, then there is a question from Suman about what are tipping points which are most closest to a cure. I think on your burning ember diagram, Nico, you showed some of them, but maybe you can also say a few words about your preference. So when you, of course, many tipping elements in the system, some we know well, some much less. So you showed just few of them, but what would be your preference in just analyzing them, and where should we start? What is the most important threat?
Yeah, I mean, the closest is probably the one with the lowest threshold. This is these are the coral reefs as well as the large ice sheets on West Antarctica and Greenland, which are where we already entered the risk zone. So those are tipping elements that may tip over somewhere between 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 degrees, respectively. However, the large ice sheets have a very long internal timescale until they are melted down. But if we commit them, so to say, now, then this long timescale tipping elements would unfold over a very long time. Yeah. So I think there are two indicators that are important. One is the threshold. The other one is the timescale that these tipping elements would unfold. And taken into account both, well, actually, there's a third one. There's direct human influence on biosphere tipping elements, such as the Amazon rainforest. So I would watch out for actually these tipping elements that already show some early warning signals. These are the ice sheets, the AMOC, but also the ones biosphere that have additional human influence, Amazon rainforest, and maybe a particular focus, given that COP30 will be in Brazil, could be to bring that up on the agenda of policymakers in this case, for the Amazon rainforest.
Mm.
Yes, I would like to add on that particularly for these slow systems like the ice sheets, the overshoot becomes very important as well. I mean, it is very clear that these are already very close to their threshold, and we should do everything to not cross it. But there is, of course, the way of overshooting a little bit, but not too much, of course. So I think understanding this is also one very important issue.
Yeah, thank you. Since if we come back to natural kind of climate tipping elements, I think or biospheric one, the Amazon is, of course, very vivid example of it. What you showed is an example, Nico, of interactions between deforestation and climate in Amazon. So we all get that in our climate models. When we deforest Amazon, we see that there is less rainfall there. I think that's results which we know for at least 20 years. Yeah, but then now this result might be challenged by high resolution models, so models which run on few kilometer resolution, and there is kind of discussion. What they show generally that it's raining more over dry spot, so it's kind of thermally driven rather than it is moisture driven. So from climate modeling perspective, it's a bit open question. So what is impact of deforestation on small scale or larger scale? So do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I can briefly comment on that. I mean, as you said, I've seen conflicting studies, let's put it that way, what will happen under global warming. In general, it will probably rain more. However, for the Amazon rainforest, and due to the location of the Andes and the atmospheric circulation patterns, it seems, and you can actually correct me here, Anna and Victor, that parts of the Amazon rainforest will get less rainfall under global warming. I've seen several studies and several Earth system models showing that, not on a kilometer scale, but on an Earth system and system-wide scale, which is actually counteracted by, as I've shown on my last slide, by a weaker AMOC, which leads to more rainfall. So the overall trend, and that's the summary that I've taken from the more recent literature, is that it is actually getting drier over at least the southern and the eastern part of the Amazon rainforest, and more or less stable over central and western parts of the Amazon rainforest.
Yeah, I think you are very right. And these shifts and these different regions have also to do with shifts in the intertropical convergence zone, of course. And that is one of the larger scale features that we think will be affected by an AMOC collapse, for example, already by an AMOC decrease. So there will be probably different regions in the Amazon rainforest, some of which receive less rain and some of which receive more rain. So yeah, it is a bit difficult to say, but there will be changes. That's quite clear, I think.
Yeah, and I think already changes. So as Nico said, and what we see in observation is that the dry season is changing. So there is, for example, it might be the same amount of rain on annual basis, but over dry season, it comes even less rain, or it is just extended. So, and that's of course affect plants, affect forest growth, and that has some impact on ecosystem, which we have not seen in the previous 100 years. I think that's also important effect. The question is, of course, how well it's captured in our models, because yes, we know that yes, economic models can be too linear, but also sometimes our models are a bit too linear. So that's yeah, but that's best what we have at the moment.
Yeah, and additionally, I mean, we've seen several very strong droughts within the last decade, and I mean, if you simulate scenarios over the Amazon rainforest without climate change, this frequency of dry years would not have been observed, to my knowledge. Just to add on top of that, so it's not only the average values, but also the extreme years that are projected to increase in frequency.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you on that. I guess we ran through most of questions, which was in Q&A, and yeah, there was only questions whether recording of webinar will be available. Yes, so the answer is yes, so you can look at it later. Yeah, just from your side, any kind of concluding remarks or comments?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to talk with you, Anna, and you, Victor. And I hope if you have any questions, please reach out to us. And then we're looking forward to the next version of the seminar. On to you, Anna.
Yes, thanks also to all of the listeners and for these very interesting questions. I think it was a very good webinar here, very good discussion.
Yeah, there is a last moment question from Gabriele Dreyfus on the extremes, but I don't remember if you had any webinar on extremes and how they can change tipping, especially on sub-regional level, but definitely that's kind of a very active research area.
Might be a good point to organize such a discussion, no?
Yeah, so now, yeah, thank you very much for your presentations and also for answering these questions. So now we come to the end, and yeah, we want, of course, to make a round of applause to you. Thank you for presenting, and many thanks to all who were still active at the moment, just staying in the webinar, and thank you for your attention and participation. And new events for 2024 will be announced on website soon. And please, Caroline could also make a link in the chat.